My name's Philip Hoare. I'm a writer. I particularly write about the sea. I think, our relationship between human and natural history is really embodied by the sea. I mean, you have this extraordinary element which sustains us, provides half the air we breathe, most of the food we eat, conducts all the commerce of modern life, and yet we sort of physically turn our backs on it, really. Partly because we know what we've done to it and its animals and its the element of the ocean has been so compromised by the coming of the Anthropocene. Whales to me are literally the biggest symbol of that extraordinary disconnection, because they are mammalian, they share a kinship with us. They'll breach out of the water, leaving their element, that element which we have so maligned, really, to join ours as a kind of symbolic confrontation of that elemental relationship that we have with the sea. And yet, this notion that, whales were saved in the 1980s, which is really not true. I think they're under more danger and perils now than ever before. So they become a very potent signifier of this industrial century, because our whaling really began full scale in the advent of the Industrial Revolution. So they are really concomitant with the Anthropocene. They are an incredibly heady symbol of that disconnection. It was the whiteness of the whale which above all things appalled me. When Melville wrote his book in 1851, he was writing in the lee of the notion, the very first notion of extinction. Extinction was a new idea. It came in the wake of the work being done by people like Georges Cuvier, John Hunter, later Darwin, and many others, into the notion of a world previous to ours, as Cuvier wrote. A notion that there had been times at which other extraordinary animals had walked and swum and flown the earth. And this was very much in Melville's mind when he wrote his book. And there are other texts which were important to Melville when he was writing. It's very interesting that Melville started working or started thinking about his book when he came to London in 1849, when he'd get drunk in the East End of London and walk back down Oxford Street and imagine sperm whales swimming down Oxford Street towards him. And it's no coincidence that when he left England, his publisher, John Murray, gave him a copy of Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, which seems to be a very interesting text when you apply to Moby-Dick. But what's really interesting and exciting for me in my connection with the Antipodes in the past few years, coming here, initially at the invitation of Ian to make a short film 3 or 4 years ago now, and then becoming more and more interested in the angle of things from here, which is very interesting to me. But it's interesting because Moby-Dick has become an obsession of mine in the past 12 years, I suppose. And because it's a drama that's played out in the Pacific, it's the first novel written based in the Pacific. It has the first indigenous person in fiction in the persona of Queequeg, who is a kind of fantastical amalgamation of peoples, but is probably really based on a Maori warrior called Tepe Kupe. And really, there's so much that one could talk about that book, which applies so much to what have we been talking about these past few days, because it is the first book to address that notion of the symbol of our disconnection from the natural world. And for me, that's most embodied in the book by a chapter called "Does the Whale Perish? Will He Become Extinct?" And it's a chapter which was read in a project I co-curated this past 2 years for the Maritime Institute at the University of Plymouth, which was an online reading of Moby-Dick, all 136 chapters read by various people, from Tilda Swinton to Stephen Fry, from Witi Imahari to John Waters, Fiona Shaw. But that chapter was read by Sir David Attenborough. And it was amazing because I don't really know Sir David. I'd written to him. Literally 2 days later, a CD arrived in my mailbox, and it was Attenborough reading this chapter. And the hairs on the back of my neck still stand on end when I even think about that chapter. And you can hear this for yourself. It's all online, free at mobydickbigread.com. It's astonishing reaction to the power of that book. But what is really interesting about Moby Dick is how often people think they know the story, possibly as a result of Hollywood movies. People think that Ahab kills the whale. Absolutely not so. The whale wins. And it's very interesting because Melville's attitude in that book towards the notion of evil with which Ahab invests the animal is a complete mirror of our own evil. In fact, what Melville's saying is that no animal is evil. Animals act according to instinct. There's only one animal that's evil. And of course, you all know the story of Moby Dick. Ahab is going in pursuit of this albino whale, although actually in the book it's not albino, it's probably more melanistic. It has big white patches on it. It's not totally white. And that quote that I said about the whiteness of the whale is actually Melville inverting the values, the prevailing values of his time. And remember that Moby Dick is being written at the time of the build-up to the greatest internecine war America would ever experience, and the shadow of which really lies over America even now. The American Civil War and the notion of slavery. That's really one of the important messages, if there is a message to Moby Dick. I don't think there really is. It's not a book with a message. That's why it's so brilliant to read. But, you know, Ahab is going in pursuit of this animal which is bitten off his leg. He stumps around on deck. You probably know the Gregory Peck, John Huston movie where he stumps on. That's the first thing you hear of Ahab, is this stumping whale ivory leg of his prosthetic leg. But actually, the imputation of the book is that it's not only his leg that was bitten off, that in fact, as a friend of mine said, it should be called Moby No Dick. Which puts an entirely different complexion on things. So for me, the reason why I'm interested in Moby Dick is not for academic reasons. It's not because it's a great work of literature. Of course it is. It transcends literature in a way. I was talking to Marcel earlier, how difficult, he's reading it at the moment, how difficult it is to read the book. I said, you've got to read it like a Quran or a Bible. You don't read it expecting narrative. There is no narrative. You're talking about a man who is channeling whales. Moby Dick would never have been finished these days if Melville was writing it, because he'd be permanently Googling whale and putting everything he knew about whales into 2 hard covers. It's a book which exists outside its time. That's why it's so prophetic, why it stands as a text for a lot of what we've been talking about today, because it predicts the whole enveloping, developing notion of imperial power being extended by these Yankee whaling fleets exporting America's influence across the world into the Pacific. And we must remember that Australia and New Zealand are founded on the whale trade, on the oil of whales. You know, these places where we are now really owe their Western conception to that trade. So this is a very important part of the book and how it stands. But for me, it's the text when you come. In fact, no one has written better than Melville possibly about the natural world, but obviously about the whale. And again, we were saying to Marcel was talking about this chapter in it called Cetology, which claims to categorize every different species of whale. And Marcel we were talking about it this morning, and he was sort of saying, this is completely, Melville's ignoring science. Well, in fact, he's not. He's completely taking the piss out of science. He's completely subverting that notion that one can extend human dominion on the natural world and classify it. He arranges that chapter like a library of books, again, trying to classify things, but he's saying how impossible that is. And the reason for that is because the whale itself is uncategorizable. It doesn't exist within the dimensions of our environment because it inhabits an environment which is entirely beyond ours, and yet which most of the planet consists of the ocean. You not only have 2/3 of the world's surface covered by ocean, but imagine the depth that it reaches in places like the Mariana Trench, the three-dimensional, physical, watery belt that runs around the planet, which is so much greater as an environment than ours, far extends our thin sliver of two-dimensional land that we call home. And in fact, in the ocean, there's no concept of home in a way. It's an entirely different way of being. And the reason why I find this particularly fascinating is because of the way the whale sits within, specifically, the Anthropocene, as in the past 200 years. Our relationship to the whale has changed so extraordinarily in those 200 years because the whole sense of regarding whales as an industrial resource is contemporary with the Industrial Revolution. So it absolutely marches step in step with the way these past 2 centuries have played out. And the whale is the victim of that perennially. We think we've saved the whale. Well, we haven't. We know we haven't. There are many, many issues facing the whale, even now. But I want to now just start to talk about the image of the whale and the way it haunts us. This is an image from a 17th century Dutch text illustrating 2 types of whales. It actually splits the two suborder of cetaceans, the mysticetes, the baleen whales, and the odontocetes, the toothed whales. The top whale is a cachalot or a sperm whale, of course a toothed whale. And the bottom is a fin whale, which of course is a baleen whale. But for any of you, and I'm very aware that you live in a whale world here. You are very lucky. I went out on a boat yesterday. I didn't see any whales, but the guys piloting the boat, were saying, at the moment you've got now 25,000 humpbacks passing Sydney shores. It's an astonishing notion. I think you had 6 humpbacks come into the harbour last year. 10% increase in humpback calves coming back on their migratory routes here. It's kind of a wonderful thing. So, whales don't look like this. They don't look like this. Whales are exquisite, hydrodynamic, sexy creatures. They're not lumpen, deflated bicycle tires with strange grinning mouths and funny little fins. But of course, at this point in time, that's the way people saw whales. Although they were using whales in their everyday life, the streets of New York, London, Berlin, and Paris were lit by whale oil. The Industrial Revolution was lubricated and lit by whale oil and whale candles. People had no real idea what these animals looked like. The only time they saw whales at all, if at all, was beached. And you know that a beached whale has already crushed itself to death. It has perished under its own magnificence, agonizing on the shore, as I read in a scientific paper the other day, It bears no resemblance to what the whale in life looks like, buoyed up in the water, part of the water, integral to the water, a reflection of the ocean. You know, the idea of the size of the whale being, it's, you know, like a goldfish growing according to the size of its tank. Well, a whale seems to reflect, you know, especially when you talk about a big whale, a blue whale, it reflects the size and extent of its environment. But this was unknown at this point in time. Although the great whaling trade, which had been begun by the English and the Dutch, and before that the Basque people, I mean, I'm talking about industrial whaling here on a small scale. I'm not talking about indigenous or sort of happenstance whaling. But that started to change very much in the late 18th century, very much coincidentally as the notion of extinction was becoming known. But even then, at the end of the 18th century, people are still looking at the sperm whale. And this is an illustration of two different species of sperm whale. The French Academy in the 1790s declared there were 14 different species of sperm whale. In some, there is only one, apart from the two pygmy versions, but there is only one type of sperm whale, species of sperm whale. It's a measure of that sort of strange, shape-shifting presence the sperm whale and whales in general have on our imagination, that people thought there were all these different types of whales. You know, we're only very, very close, you know, in a Linnaean world, and it's only one step away from, you know, alchemy. You know, Isaac Newton was an alchemist. You know, the developing knowledge of the natural world is extraordinarily disjunctured and paradoxical. And in nowhere is that more evident than in the shape of the whale. Because although these animals are being killed, and it's very interesting, in Moby-Dick, Melville refers constantly throughout the book to the whale as a fish. Now, Melville had spent 5 years on a whaling ship, including on a Sydney-registered whaling ship, interestingly enough, which he escaped from the Marquesas, where he deserted on his whaling voyage, because do you remember being on a whaling ship was the shittiest job in the whole of the maritime world. You were covered in blubber and blood for 5 years, and you could come back owing money to the ship because you'd had to buy your supplies and your clothes and everything, and if greasy luck wasn't with you, you know, if you hadn't killed enough whales, then you hadn't made enough money to get your percentage of the profits. So Melville knew, as did his fellow whalers, far more than anyone else what the whale looked like, and that its physiology was entirely mammalian, because they were deconstructing these animals every day of the hunt. They were taking them apart. It's very interesting, when I was writing my recent book, The Sea Inside, I attended the necropsy of a harbour porpoise at the Zoological Society of London. And this strange sort of cellar underneath a 1930s block next to London Zoo. This great big double doors opened up, and out of a huge freezer was this big black plastic bin bag hauled out on chains. And into the room, as you could hear all the cries of the elephants and parrots and giraffes outside in the zoo beyond, and this big black bag was brought in onto a stainless steel mortuary table, you know, with a drain in the middle of it, and unwrapped, and it was a harbour porpoise. And it was perfect. It might have still sort of got up and swam away. But what was really interesting, as the pathologist, Rob Davell, a very expert whale pathologist, unzipped the animal with his scalpel like a sushi chef, was the fact that as the animal came apart, I felt me being reflected in it, because you had an animal which is pretty much the size of a human being, and all the organs arranged in the way a human body is arranged. And as it came apart, and it came down to, you know, this pile of offal, really, in a way. But to me, and I'd been really trepidatious about seeing an animal which I have a great deal of affection for being deconstructed in that way, but I felt the intense beauty of seeing this animal in the inside as well as the outside. The interior of it was as extraordinary as the outside. But that sense of what those animals looked like for Melville, the reason why he calls the animal a fish in the book, I think, is a piece of, again, sort of shape-shifting trickery, and also partly an acknowledgement of the fact that those whalers were very aware of the sentience of these creatures, because they were using that sentience to kill them. You know, it's one of the most appalling things about whaling is that the common technique was to kill a calf and wait until the mother came in, and the rest of the whales, who act, of course, in a very cohesive social manner, to protect the calves, and then they, of course, were killed. So the whalers knew that these animals were not fish, but it's as if they were using that word to kind of obscure their guilt, in a way. And that's another aspect of what Melville was talking about. And Melville writes very much about the image of the whale. And Melville, after all, is an incredibly visual writer. This is one of the reasons why that book is so long and so aggressive, because he can't resist explaining everything in visual terms. He was inspired by Turner's paintings of sperm whales. And very interestingly, in his notes, Melville writes that Turner was, in turn, inspired by this artist, a early 19th century engraver who'd provided the illustrations for the first scientific text about sperm whales, Thomas Beale, The Natural History of the Sperm Whale, published in 1835. And Melville says in Moby-Dick that this is the first really accurate depiction of a sperm whale. All those others were just travesties. Suddenly someone really, and partly because Thomas Beale was a ship surgeon who'd come to the Pacific on a whale ship. Every British whale ship had to have a surgeon on board, and Beale was one of these. And he became very interested in the biology of the sperm whale, made drawings, made notations. The book is actually available online. It's a fantastic book. Very interestingly, when you read the book and you compare it to Moby-Dick, you see that Melville was an arch plagiarist. He lifted entire chunks out of Beale's book, as he did with another book, William Scoresby's An Account of the Arctic Regions. I mean, nowadays, you would throw your students out of class for bringing this material in. He was, plus the fact that actually Melville stole these books from the New York Public Library, adds to the crime, but then, of course, all great artists steal. And although this illustration from Beale's book is slightly caricatured, I mean, sperm whales don't quite look as blocky and square as that. It's pretty accurate in many respects. And it is a reflection of this extraordinary trade. But again, very interestingly, the whaling trade of the 19th century, which you see represented here in principally the British whaling trade and of course the American whaling trade, which came very much to the Pacific, which was the great arena of this cull, this appalling cull. As bad as that was, it was still on a slightly, I mean, I'm not saying it's a level playing field, but it wasn't like what the Nishin Maru is doing in the Southern Ocean nowadays, which is with grenade harpoons and radar and all the other sort of appurtenances of the modern killing of whales, which appallingly is being conducted even now. But in the year in which I was born, more whales were killed in that 1 year alone than died in the whole 150 years, the extent of Yankee whaling, the famous period of whaling. Whales could have survived, actually, if whaling had sort of diminished in the way that it did, partly because of the discovery of petroleum and mineral oil in 1859, Titusville, Pennsylvania, when suddenly the whale oil was outmoded by this new source of power, which was obviously disastrous for us, really. So, very strangely, the whales slightly seem to benefit from from that aspect of the Anthropocene. And indeed, baleen whales, which were being hunted as much for their baleen plates as much as they were for their oil, the baleen plates were being used for corsets. And the fact that corsets went out of fashion in the late 19th, early 20th century actually was a reprieve for baleen whales as well. But it didn't last very long. In the 1960s, when I was growing up in Southampton, there were still ships coming from the Southern Ocean laden with whale oil. That whale oil was brought into my hometown, my home port, and processed into margarine. Stalk margarine contained whale oil. I ate whales when I was a kid. My mother at night would kiss me goodnight, and as her cheek brushed mine, the whale oil in her cosmetics remained in a residue on my cheek. If you played tennis, your rackets were strung with whale guts. Plimsolls trainers were laced with whale gut. Whales were still, in the 1960s and even into the 70s, still part of the commerce of the modern world. And at the same time, as we heard in Richard's wonderful presentation this morning, there was a new awareness and a new sensibility emerging in reaction to the depredations of the natural world, partly inspired by people like Rachel Carson. But really, for me, the key moment, and it really is a key moment, I think, in the change, is when Roger Payne and Scott McVeigh, out off Hawaii, lowered a hydrophone into the water and recorded the song of a humpback whale. Suddenly, these animals, which had been dumb, had a voice. And not only a voice, an intensely beautiful, abstract voice, something which even now is beyond our comprehension. It's not just to do with mating. It's the most extraordinary sound in nature. And when you speed it up, it sounds like birdsong. So that was an incredible shift change. Just a psychic, tectonic shift in awareness. I mean, it's why Friends of the Earth, it's why Greenpeace were born. It's why the Save the Whale campaign has almost become a kind of cliche of environmentalism. Partly because, actually, we believe we have saved the whale. But as a boy growing up in Southampton in the 1960s, I wasn't aware of those politics. All I knew was that I was obsessed with these animals. Like other kids are obsessed with dinosaurs, I was obsessed with whales. And actually, my sisters and I, they joined me in this obsession, pestered our parents to take us to a place called Windsor Safari Park. Windsor Safari Park is now Legoland. But at that time, it's just outside Windsor, obviously, and it had an oceanarium, a dolphinarium at captive cetaceans. The nuances of that really escaped me as a young boy. I was just desperate to see these animals in the flesh. And so myself and my sisters pestered our parents to drive us up to Windsor. And we got to the pool, sat in the front row, and waited for the show to begin. In came the dolphin from their holding pen. And they started going through their routine, jumping through a hoop, balancing a ball on their nose, catching fish in their beaks. And I started to feel uneasy. I thought, this isn't what I meant. I meant to be feeling really excited, but there's something wrong there. There's something bad happening in my head in a way, but also in what I saw in front of me. And it started to change the way I felt about this. And actually, that was only small scale, because halfway through the performance, the pool was cleared of dolphin. And at the other end of the pool, a big black gate lifted up, and in swam Ramu, killer whale, the alpha predator of the ocean, probably one of the most successful animals ever to have existed, present in every sea, ultimately sentient, ultimately social, incredibly successful at what it does. This beautiful, slick, black and white icon of the ocean in this overgrown municipal swimming pool. And then, even more shockingly, it went through the same routine. Jumped through a hoop, balanced a ball on its nose, caught fish in its beak. A most humbling thing to see an animal reduced to this performing circus creature. And as a symbol of that sort of captivity, of the wildness of this beautiful creature, its dorsal fin, which stands 2 meters high as the highest dorsal fin of any animal in the animal kingdom, had flopped like a detumescent symbol of its imprisonment. And for me, that was a really disturbing moment, because it spoilt the romance. It spoilt the love affair. These weren't animals in pictures or on Jacques Cousteau films. Suddenly they were slightly shabby, scuffed about animals basically being kept in a chlorine tank. And I kind of had to dismiss them. I couldn't handle it. I had to dismiss them from my emotional space in a way. I couldn't handle that whole thing. And I realize now, of course, that in the sort of miasma, the media miasma such as it was in the 1960s, which seems now an antediluvian age when it comes to digital technology and media, I realized I was almost osmotically absorbing this new message. I wasn't aware of it. There was no Guardian online to read at that point. But I knew it, I felt it. And so for the rest of my teenage life and my young adult life, I sort of still loved the notion of the whale, but dismissed its relationship with human beings because it was too difficult to handle in a way for me. It was too emotionally charged for me. And it wasn't until the year 2000, when probably on my second or third visit to the United States, I'd gone to visit a friend of mine in Provincetown. And Provincetown is at the tip of Cape Cod, and Cape Cod is held out like a sandy arm from the coast of New England. It curls round into the Atlantic and ends in a kind of clenched fist at the very fingertips of which is Provincetown, which back in the day, in the 19th century, was one of the biggest whaling ports. And now, unbeknownst to me, it's become one of the great whale-watching capitals of the world. I didn't know anything about this, actually, when I went to Provincetown on that trip to see my friend, who's a filmmaker called John Waters, and I'd been visiting with him. And at the end of the stay, I was standing on the wharf, Macmillan Wharf, waiting for the water ferry to take me back to Boston and back to the airport and back home. And I had time to kill before the next ferry arrived. And I saw a placard advertising whale watching on the pier side. And I thought, all those old memories came back and flooding back. And I thought, what's this? Is this just another mediated sort of circus experience? What are they presenting me with here? Nonetheless, I conquered my skepticism, paid my $12 and got on the boat, and stood rather defiantly at the prow with my arms folded, sort of, show me what you got. And half an hour later, in the middle of Stellwagen Bank, out in the Atlantic Ocean, a 50-foot, 50-ton humpback whale breached 20 feet away from the boat. This incredible animal, incredibly confrontational piece of living flesh, exhibiting its mammalian kinship with us by leaving its environment briefly to be part of ours, to demonstrate that kinship. And it hung there as though someone had put the pause button on nature, on the video, on the Jacques Cousteau, David Attenborough film. with a halo of diamond sea spray hanging around it. It was a poetic image, and being a practiced writer, I responded in a poetic way. I said, "Fuck!" Unfortunately, I was surrounded by a group of high school kids when I was actually younger than that. Really embarrassing. But at that moment, you know, that sense of reconnection was made. And I just became obsessed once more. The whole obsession was reborn. I kept going back to Provincetown. I'd go on 1 whale watch a day, 2 whale watches a day, 3 whale watches. I was like a crack addict. So the captains on the boats would look at me really strange, and who's this weird limey taking these photographs, all these questions. My friend John accused me of being a whale stalker. And when I showed him these photographs, he said, "That's just whale porn." But, you know, I'd become so reconnected to these animals, I just wanted to close that distance. I wanted to get closer. I just wanted to breach that distance which exists between all of us and the natural world, in all ways, shapes and forms. I just wanted to... I didn't think about it in an academic or a literary way at all. You know, it was something I just felt drawn to do. It was only later that I started to write about it, partly because of the Melville connection. You know, I felt, how can we write about whales in lieu of Melville? And in fact, I realized the way to do it was to write about it through Melville in a way, and I wrote Leviathan through Melville. And subsequent to that, in the past 12 years now, I've had astonishing encounters with whales. And this is blue whale in Sri Lanka. And all those whales I've seen have been, in various different ways, performers. The humpback whale, as you know out here, is a great performer. It's, you know, a friend of mine calls them the Barbie of whales. You know, they're all singing or dancing. But there's one whale which remains so symbolic of all whales, because it is the whale that was hunted so much in the 19th century, and it is the sperm whale. And the sperm whale, for me, is a deeply mysterious animal. And it's a very difficult animal to see, because unlike the humpbacks, like the right whales, it doesn't really hug coastlines. It's a pelagic animal which feeds at great depth. And a sperm whale is a natural submarine. It is a shapeshifter. It actually changes shape to dive. You know, when a sperm whale gets ready to dive, it charges its muscles, its blood, with oxygen. Obviously, a whale doesn't hold its breath to dive. You know, it charges with oxygen. The body itself transforms, so that big, square, blocky head actually contracts and becomes wedge-like. So the sort of counterintuitive notion of a sperm whale being this sort of weird, unhydrodynamic shape actually completely changes as it begins to dive. The pectoral flippers fit into pockets in the flanks of the animal's side, like an aircraft's undercarriage. Every organ shuts down apart from the brain and the heart. The ribs collapse, lubricated by a kind of special mucus. Everything about this animal is engineered to go down, 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 for up to a mile, and to stay down for more than 2 hours. So this animal, which should be called a surfacer, in the words of Hal Whitehead, the great sperm whale scientist, rather than a diver, it spends 90% of its time under the water. It's a very difficult animal to see. And living in Britain, where I do, in Southampton, the nearest place you can see sperm whales is this place, the Azores, which is an archipelago in the middle of the Atlantic, equidistant between Lisbon and Boston. It's a black, satanic, barbaric place. It's no golden beaches on the Azores. They're just the tips of volcanoes. You go 100 yards out from the shores of this island, the island of Pico, and the water descends into a half a mile in depth. You go a mile out, 3 miles, 2 miles out, 5 or 6 miles in depth. Incredibly profound waters. And these are the waters in which sperm whales hunt for their main food, squid. And when I went there, 2007, in search of sperm whales, we went out on a rib, fast, rigid, inflatable boat. with a young Azorian captain, very experienced captain. As we left the harbour, a pod of common dolphin came and started swimming the biowave, riding the compression wave of the boat. It seemed as though they were leading us somewhere. Again, that seems sort of anthropomorphic and poetic, but actually dolphin often do associate with sperm whales. This photograph I took that day from the bow. I wasn't in the water. This is how clear the water was that day. And as we came out of the harbour, we were only half a mile out of the harbour. The captain jammed the engines shut of the rib and said, "This is your opportunity." About 200 yards in front of us were grey shapes in the water. I couldn't associate them with anything animate. They looked like logs. I'd never seen animals like that. It was impossible to know that they were whales at all until a great square head raised up out of the water, or the flukes raised up at the other end. And sperm whales, as much as they're shapeshifters, actually change colour. Sometimes they look glossy ebony black, sometimes dove grey, sometimes of the colour of cocoa, mauve, outrageous animals. And as we came closer to these animals, the idea, I was with a filmmaker who's the reason why Ian and I know one another, Adam Lowe, who made a film with me about Moby-Dick. And the idea was actually to film these whales and me sort of in the water. The captain of the boat said, you are never going to get a better opportunity. The water is in perfect condition, it's cat's paw calm. The animals are hanging out, they're chilled, they're socializing. And so there's a degree of urgency about getting into the water. I didn't have time to put my wetsuit on. I jammed my mask on, snorkel and fins, jumped in. The person who was meant to be filming me had a panic attack because she had the underwater camera attached to her by a lanyard. She felt this camera was actually sinking. She thought she was going down that deep with the camera. So she was pulled back out. The director, Adam, starts shouting at me, come back, Philip. I am not coming back. This is my opportunity. And I'm swimming towards the whales, and as clear as that water looks from above, when you're in it, the lateral visibility is entirely reduced because the water is full of zooplankton and phytoplankton, like little universes, like little planets and asteroids drifting around in front of you. Incredibly dreamy, but very obscuring. And I'm swimming towards 12 or 14 of the largest animals on Earth, and I can't see them. And I'm getting closer and closer. My heart's beating. I'm thinking, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. Because suddenly I'm only 20 yards away from these whales when suddenly I see them. My vision is wall-to-wall whale. At that point, I lose control of my bodily functions for the first time since I was a little boy, and I think, Jesus, if you do that when sharks are around, it's meant to get them really annoyed. And then I think, how rude to come visiting and piss on someone's doorstep. At that point, the largest of the animals, actually what I've realized now in retrospect was the matriarch of the group. These are matriarchal animals, entirely socially arranged around the matriarchal unit, detached itself from the pod and started swimming towards me and kept on coming. I thought, okay, this is the only whale which can and indeed has swallowed a human being, and it's not a nice way to go because they've got gastric juices so strong that in the whaling days when people were accidentally swallowed by whales, I mean, whales wouldn't do it on purpose, and were cut out of the whales afterwards. They'd been bleached white by the process. All this is going through my head like a drowning man as this whale is coming closer and closer. And then I don't hear, I feel through my skull, through my sternum, through the whole of my skeletal structure, the whale's sonar echolocating me. I feel a three-dimensional sound picture of me being beamed back to the whale's head. I don't hear it, I feel that. And I've been in an MRI scanner. It's a very similar process, but this was a natural process. And it was ironic, I'd spent 12 years trying to describe a whale, and here is a whale trying to describe me. And then it came right alongside, and I could have easily reached out and touched it, like as close as that laptop is to me now. And we swam side by side, eye to eye. the animal's eye, which is no bigger than a grapefruit, looking at me with absolute sentience. It's not the eye of a horse or a cow. It absolutely was reading me. The only thing I could think of was to say was sorry. And then it dove from this kind of extraordinary Eve Klein blue into the black. And as it did that, I was laughing to myself because it was like all those childhood dreams suddenly became real and yet entirely unreal. So untouchable, so silent, the choreography of this thing. You know, I didn't learn to swim until I was 25, and here I was in waters, 3 miles deep with the animals, the largest predator that ever existed. It just seemed an entire disconnection, and yet the most intimate and enveloping connection you could have with a living creature. And that night, when I went back to shore, I couldn't close my eyes, because every time I closed my eyes, the whale swam into my head. And Hal Whitehead, who I've now become very friendly with, great whale scientist, did some of the original sperm whale research off Sri Lanka, had a young female student, who had a very similar experience with a sperm whale that echolocated her, and she claimed never to have been mentally right there afterwards. Well, it explains a lot, doesn't it? Thank you very much. Sorry, that's me with a few friends. Which is very interesting to me, but it's interesting because Moby-Dick has become an obsession of mine in the past 12 years, I suppose. And because it's a drama that's played out in the Pacific, it's the first novel written based in the Pacific. It has the first indigenous person in fiction in the persona of Queequeg, who is a kind of fantastical amalgamation of peoples, but is probably really based on a Maori warrior called Tepe Kupe. And really, there's so much that one could talk about that book, which applies so much to what have we been talking about these past few days, because it is the first book to address that notion of the symbol of our disconnection from the natural world. And for me, that's most embodied in the book by a chapter called Does the Whale Perish? My name's Philip Hoare. I'm a writer. I particularly write about the sea. I think, our relationship between human and natural history is really embodied by the sea. I mean, you have this extraordinary element which sustains us, provides half the air we breathe, most of the food we eat, conducts all the commerce of modern life, and yet we sort of physically turn our backs on it, really. Partly because we know what we've done to it and its animals, and the element of the ocean has been so compromised by the coming of the Anthropocene, which were important to Melville when he was writing. It's very interesting that Melville started working or started thinking about his book when he came to London in 1849, when he'd get drunk in the East End of London and walk back down Oxford Street and imagine sperm whales swimming down Oxford Street towards him. And it's no coincidence that when he left England, his publisher, John Murray, gave him a copy of Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, which seems to be a very interesting text when you apply to Moby-Dick. But what's really interesting and exciting for me in my connection with the Antipodes in the past few years, coming here, initially at the invitation of Ian to make a short film 3 or 4 years ago now, and then becoming more and more interested in the angle of things from here, of that disconnection. It was the whiteness of the whale which above all things appalled me. When Melville wrote his book in 1851, he was writing in the lee of the notion, the very first notion of extinction. Extinction was a new idea. It came in the wake of the work being done by people like Georges Cuvier, John Hunter, later Darwin, and many others, into the notion of a world previous to ours, as Cuvier wrote, a notion that there had been times at which other extraordinary animals had walked and swum and flown the earth. And this was very much in Melville's mind when he wrote his book. And there are other texts. Whales, to me, are literally the biggest symbol of that extraordinary disconnection, because they are mammalian, they share a kinship with us. You know, they'll breach out of the water, leaving their element, that element which we have so maligned, really, to join ours as a kind of symbolic confrontation of that elemental relationship that we have with the sea. And yet, you know, this notion that, you know, whales were saved in the 1980s, which is really not true. You know, I think they're under more danger and perils now than ever before. So they become a very potent signifier of this you know, industrial century, because our whaling really began full scale in the advent of the Industrial Revolution. So they are really concomitant with the Anthropocene. They are an incredibly heady symbol of